This is a public hearing on Resolution 2024-24, establishing a fee schedule for records requests. Administrative Support Coordinator Kirsten Hildeman. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you very much. So, as you all might remember, we did waive the first reading of this, but I did discuss this with all of you prior to that first reading to let you know that this was coming in to help us be in compliance with HB 1002, which was passed earlier this year. I did some reading going back as far as about the middle of last year, looking at the past 91A requests. And I will say that the changes here would have only affected one, maybe two of the requests that we've received would have actually been charged. When I was here before, both Councillor Dunn and Councillor Faber had some suggestions in terms of the content and how much we were charging and whom we were charging. I did edit it to include for black and white printing, up to 10 pages total free, in accordance with what Councillor Dunn suggested. I did not adjust the color one. Part of that is because our color costs are astronomically higher. And for most intents and purposes, for what people are requesting, black and white is fine. Yep. Councillor Faber, you had suggested that we maybe look at residents versus non-residents. We did start to look into that, but the provisions of the RSA do not distinguish between town residents and not, so we were concerned about where the legal ground would be on that, what legal standing we would be on that, what we would be opening ourselves up to by delineating, and it's not always straightforward to tell who is requesting something in order to determine that.
I looked at that myself and I came to the same conclusions.
I will say the new HB 1002 does contain a provision, as does the policy that you see written here for electronic communication of 91A records, that allows exemptions for any individual who can determine they are indigent, media requesters, and any individual requesting information where the disclosure is in public interest. I will say we do currently, as long as we've had the right to know policy on the website, we have indicated that there is a charge for photocopies. In calendar year 2024, I think I might have my first person who's taking me up on that this coming week, for a commercial requester who's out of state. So this is not something that comes up frequently, but having a consistent charge would let us be transparent and open with people about what this process is going to cost them up front, rather than having them perhaps suggest that we're applying it capriciously, or, you know, it gets everybody on the same page as well, which I think is extraordinarily important for this topic. So that's what I have for you.
All right, so before I go to the council, folks, this is public comment. So I'd like to welcome anyone who'd like to have any questions or comments regarding Resolution 224-22. Seeing none, we'll go to the council.
So my only thought is, could we have 10 pages free under the scanning part too? Not just the printing, or is there a reason not to have that? Because I see the two main categories, printing and photocopying and scanning. So I see that above, but I didn't see it below.
The only issue with that is that the vast majority of the people who want scanning are commercial requesters, but there's no, and that's honestly why I didn't put that in there. However, there's absolutely no reason, if the council wants it, that we could not put it in there as well.
Do commercial requesters usually, is there a threshold where they'd usually go beyond, like would they usually go beyond 10 pages? Would it be something where we scaled it back where we get most of them?
Yeah, so the commercial requests, and we've seen, it's been interesting because lately we've seen a significant uptick in commercial requests and a drop in local requesters recently. Commercial requests are largely firms around the country who have been retained to do work researching properties in town, so they often cast a wide net in their request. All documents for the past 20 years regarding any building permit on this property or any code violation on this property. So it's usually a substantial amount, and how you define that can be wide.
But most likely over 10 pages, I would think.
So yes, most likely over 10 pages in each file, yes. Very
I
much
think
so.
that they typically are building and zoning inquiries. So somebody who, please tell me everything you know about this, not exactly like that, but this address, right? And then, so it depends, and that was, I think, Kirsten's hesitancy is some building and zoning files have nothing in them if it's undeveloped land. Some are this big if there's an enforcement history. So, and the thing with building, the building department files is they go back, to the 70s. Everything is on like a different size sheet of paper. But I think that the way to skin the cat may be, and I offer as a suggestion that we build in sort of that we codify what we're already doing, which is waiving our practices if appropriate. We will, if somebody comes in and asks for something that's easily producible, even though we might require them to come in and look at it under the statute, we don't. And so I think that if that's the consensus of the council, that that 10-page mark, if it's not a commercial requester, if it's somebody who seems to have, a legitimate area of inquiry, we can waive that. I think that, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Kirsten.
No, to give an example of that, I did have one request where almost every document, about 110 documents, were email, and then there was 3 individual pages that only existed on paper. Rather than ask the person to come in and see those 3 pages, it was much easier, much more cost efficient for everyone involved if I just scanned those 3 pages in. And so that's an example where we used our discretion based on the situation.
Mr. DeFrancisco. Name and address, sir, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tony DeFrancisco, One Cheshire. Just so that you know, a commercial, on the commercial side of the ledger, someone who is requesting that information, who's a commercial vendor, for lack of a better term, I don't know how else to describe it, whatever we charge them is pass-through money anyway to that vendor. So
To the applicant.
so there's really there's kind of no reason to give them a break. I see no reason at all, because it could be an appraiser trying to get some commercial feedback on a project that's going to happen in Hudson. And so they have to cast such a much wider net, because it's not a 3-family house that's readily available in Hudson. Commercial is so specific that it could be a project that's in Laconia that they're comparing. It could be one in Portsmouth that they're comparing. And so it's not even going to this stuff isn't even going to happen in Londonderry. They're just fishing, basically. So 2 things. Number one, I think your color documents are way too cheap. I think it's way more than double, based on how I look at it. Number one. Number two, I see no reason to do the same thing for commercial scanning that we do for black and white, to give them a free ride for 10 copies. It just doesn't make any sense. Scanning is way harder than pulling a file. Way more. You have to admit, it's way more work.
Scanning does take longer than photocopying.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
significantly.
why you give them a break, I don't know.
So to clarify my comments, mine wasn't for the commercial scenario, because,
Yeah.
it's pass-through. You have agreed. That's exactly right. It's more for the scenario you outlined, where someone's going to have to scan, and they have 3 pages, and then they either have to come in, and it's a local request, it's something like that. So that's why I was concerned, and that's also why I asked if it's going to be the typical commercial is over 10 pages, because then it's like, yeah, they can.
Sure, and that's where the discretion comes in.
Yep.
Here's your 3 copies. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So if I can real quick. Thank you. Ashley, go ahead.
Mr. Town Manager, you had kind of alluded to it, and certainly did Kirsten Hilloden, that it's quite time-consuming scanning documents, and especially larger documents that may be hard to manipulate onto our scanners. And sometimes, the question maybe is, do we have the right size scanner? And I'm wondering if $2 per page is even the right amount of money, and that might need to be increased because of the time, labor that goes into that,
Yeah, I mean, I can,
especially with how busy our building department already is.
right. I can let Kirsten speak to that. Yeah, it is undoubtedly the case that scanning, particularly if it's not like a nicely collated set of recently printed documents, is a pain in the neck.
So in terms of the scanning of documents larger than 11 by 14, it is certainly subject to availability. Under the state law, we are required to provide documents in the form that they currently exist. So if they currently exist in digital form, we provide them in digital form. If they currently exist in physical form, if somebody is out of state, we will, and they want copies, we offer them photocopies, which is the easiest and least labor-intensive way of doing it for us. If the reason the scanning is there, and I will say there's a very specific circumstance in which people, it has to do with election materials, is what people want scanned most.
Interesting.
We get requests to scan in checklists, return to undeclared lists that only exist in physical form. And that's probably, there was no provision for doing it before. There was just a hard no.
Gotcha.
Now, the guidance from the Secretary of State's office has shifted slightly. So if we are going, if we can scan and implement our policies, to charge for it if they exist. Now, I have scanned in a checklist before. It's back before I worked for the town when I was a supervisor. It's an extraordinarily time-consuming process. And while you're not creating a physical record and costing the town physical money, because it is an optional service, we are not required under law to do that process. Then, because we are changing the form of the document, the Secretary of State's office has issued the guidance that yes, you can follow your town's policy for scanning and charging for that.
Okay.
And so that's where this comes from. If the documents already exist electronically under 91A, we don't charge at all for them, with the exception, and this is the new piece, of email requests totaling over 250 messages. The point of this is and we've gotten a couple of them. That's why I said there's one, maybe two, that this would have applied to if this existed in the beginning of 2023, where somebody simply asks for all emails between this person and this person mentioning this word. That is legally and technically and absolutely searchably a narrow enough request under 91A if you're requesting between one person and another person mentioning a word. Or all emails sent to these 4 people in town from this person. That's very narrowly defined. We can absolutely search that. But oftentimes those requests will turn up thousands of results. And so after we pull those thousands of results, we actually have to go through them one by one and redact them and make sure that we're redacting personal information, anything that's attorney-client privileged. So that is why the state in HB 1002 said, yes, you can now charge if the result of the request is going to be over 250 emails. Or you can approach the person and ask them to narrow down the request to the most pertinent information. So it's designed to help guide individuals to the information they're looking for while avoiding the wide net results, which are not going to be helpful to the requester or to transparency efforts of the government.
I guess what I was trying to get at was more real estate plans and what we have in the building department. If they are large size plans that are time consuming and large to manipulate, that could be quite time consuming
So
on our
those are
building
the
department.
wide format printouts. Those are
Right.
$5 a page. You notice there's not a wide format printout listed under scanning.
Right.
So that's not a regular option under scanning.
Okay.
Documents larger than 11 by 14 are not wide format printouts. Those would only be available for $5 per page, which is actually consistent with what the building department currently charges.
I guess my question would be, is that even enough money? Do we want to charge more than that $5?
Yeah, I mean,
That
to,
is,
to your point, Mr. Vice Chair, that is where you would find a lot of those wide format
Right.
documents, and yeah,
It's time consuming.
it's very time consuming.
Right.
Ron?
I mean, a thought from the council on that piece. I mean, it's time consuming on our staff for these requests from commercial entities across the country or state.
Tony also mentioned the color copies. Is it something we should look more into?
I'm probably not the right person
Okay,
to
I know.
answer what the cost
so
of a color
the
copy
other
is.
thing is that
Yeah.
there are bounds of what has been generally considered allowable in terms of what's considered a fair and reasonable cost for a copy. We are allowed to capture the actual cost of making the copy, which includes the wear and tear on the printer, labor, the cost that our contract company charges us. There is no clear provision in the RSA for charging for labor. So if we inch up too high for a cost, we run the risk of somebody challenging us. That exact number has not yet been adjudicated by the state court. I'm sure it will be at some point, and we'll have a much firmer guideline. And the general guidance by the NHMA is to review this fee schedule each year.
Okay.
So my general thought is for each fiscal year, this will come around, and the council, you all will have the ability to look at it and say, we need to increase these costs. We don't need this. And this is just the first incarnation of it. So to respond to you, I think you're both absolutely right. My hesitancy and my initial judgment placing it here was this seemed well within the safe margin for what we would not receive blowback for having unreasonable costs.
Fair enough.
I'd wholeheartedly agree with that, and I'd like to keep these the same unless somebody has a good reason to follow.
Yeah, so I would agree with Sean. There's nothing saying that we can't, with proper notice, revisit this annually or even sooner if needed.
Absolutely.
So I think my personal opinion is I think maybe proceeding as written would be a good way to kind of get a gauge and see how it is, and we can always adjust if needed or as required. Thoughts?
Sounds
My
fair.
only last thought is, do we have an accounting upon how much we've received in the past?
I'm sorry?
Do we have an accounting for how much we've received in the past for printing and photocopying?
Costs?
And costs.
That's a good question. So, we know, I think, what we have. I think it would be difficult to parse out. Maybe you can elaborate.
So since I took over providing the responses to people who did not require going through legal, I have not provided physical photocopies to anyone in the past calendar year. I know earlier in the calendar year there were some that were provided on physical photocopies. Almost every record has been electronic, or they have, we've had a couple of commercial groups come in and look at the records themselves, and then they can take their own pictures, and that's that. As far as the over 251, like I said, I think we would have had two, but I don't see this photocopying honestly changing much more in the day-to-day. Except I would have said it wouldn't change at all unless I had somebody last week who put in a request who wants photocopies. So this is the first one that I've seen in 14, 15 months.
And I think the other benefit of it is, and I don't want to rehash the whole argument for or against 1002, but I think that what this is going to do is, to the person who just is thinking about from their living room sending in a request like Kirsten described for all emails that the town manager has sent in the last 10 months. Well, now you have a policy that you have to consult, and it has numbers and it has dollar signs attached to it. And And hopefully it just gives a little bit more pause before we get some of these requests. It's not prohibiting anybody from doing it, but it's something that hasn't been the case before, and I think that that's beneficial.
So more so in compliance to state law.
Correct.
Okay. So before we go to the council for a vote, I'd like to remind those in attendance that this is a public hearing, and more than welcome to input at any time. Seeing none, so at this time, before I have a motion and a second, if you have two options, three, but if you would like to see this amended with any changes, at that time, the counselor can make a motion to amend with a suggestion. We'll take a vote, or you can make a motion to adopt as written. Ordinance Resolution 204-22. So with that, I'll accept the motion. However,
I will motion to adopt as written,
all
Mr.
right.
Chair.
So I have a motion from Ted. Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a second from Ron. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Chairman votes in the affirmative. Resolution 2024-22 is adopted.